I hope you have enjoyed the film. For those who are staying, we will now have a Q&A with the director. I just want to inform you again that this session is streamed live on the internet, and there's a hashtag that is on the screen that you can see there that you can use to ask questions. I will be going back and forth between the audience here in Brussels and the questions online. You have also to know that this session is also streamed in different cinemas across Europe where the Lux Film Days are being broadcasted. So without further ado, I'm welcoming on stage now the director of The Other Side of Everything, Mila Turajlic. Welcome, Mila. Okay, we could have 35 minutes of applause, but I suggest we move to the questions. Now I have a first question for you, Mila. Congratulations for the film. How long did it take to shoot it?
The process of working on the film was 5 years, even though there is material you see in the film that I shot even before. Ideally, this was going to be my first film, and then I realized I wasn't mature enough either as a person or as a filmmaker to do it, so it ended up being my second film.
And did you realize by the time you were starting working on the project where the project was going? Did you?
I really thought that I was making a film about a door. This is how I presented it in all of the fund applications and so on. I really thought I was going to use this. I knew that the film would never leave the apartment, this much I knew. And I knew that there would be this use of windows as a way of showing the outside world vis-a-vis the inside world. But I really thought that I was making something that was a chronicle of a family that was revealing something of a story of the country. What I didn't factor in was my mother. She was supposed to be just one of the characters in the space. You've seen my mother, so you understand how she came to take more space in the film. But what happened is that over these 5 years, I grew up and I stopped seeing her as a daughter looks at a mother, and I started looking at her as an adult, looking at another adult. And I actually realized in the editing room that what I had been asking her wasn't so much tell me the family story, tell me the history. It was really a need to understand the decisions that she had made in her life, you know, about engaging, about responsibility. And the film took another direction, and it became this dialogue between the two of us about political engagement and responsibility. But that was not at all the film I thought I was making.
So there's this dialogue that is quite intimate, that is happening inside this apartment. It's a family dialogue, and then outside of those windows, something else is happening. And those last 5 years, a lot of things has been happening in Serbia and in Europe and in the world. So how did you, at some point, assess the fact that history was somehow repeating itself?
I mean, when I started making this film, it wasn't so clear that we were going back to square one. Over time, that became very clear, and so it became a very necessary element in this film, which is why we have, towards the end, this jump from the moment of the revolution to 15 years later. And we leave out quite a bit of recent history there, but it was just to show where we are today, and mostly, I think, to show the consequences of the fact that we never managed to tell that story. So you have 18-year-olds today in Serbia who have the right to vote, who know nothing about what happened in the 90s and who was Milosevic. And this is our fault, because we never told them. Because we were a divided country, because it was a story that was too difficult to tell, because our tendency has always been to erase the past. So in the same way that the communists erased the trace of a monarchist Yugoslavia, in the 90s the nationalists erased any trace of a communist socialist Yugoslavia. And bizarrely, when we had a revolution in 2000, we erased the traces of the 90s. And so I think what makes the reason we're trapped in this cycle is that we're actually unable to tell our story.
You were mentioning that your mother is kind of the main character. She is, sorry, the main character of the film. You're also one of the characters of the film. You have a voice in the film as well. And I was surprised that Milosevic is also a character of the film, but he's silent. I mean, you don't give him one single line of dialogue. Can you tell us a little bit more about that conscious choice?
I'm really impressed that you picked up on that. I didn't want to give politicians any voice in the film. Because none of what I did in that decade, or my mother did, I think was motivated by belief in any particular politician. So I didn't want to give them a platform. For me, because the story was being told from the inside and from the intimate, it was about giving everyday people, you know, the people in my surrounding and my family a voice rather than making it a stage for politicians. So yes, there was a very conscious choice not to give him any lines of dialogue, but then if you watch carefully, you notice I broke that rule, because at the very end, when we're watching the election results, our new prime minister / president, he gets a line of dialogue. But I was trying, you know, to really leave the film on a very intimate and personal level.
At some point in the film, there's kind of a switch. I mean, you're pressuring your mother at the beginning to tell the story, and some things clearly she wants to live in the past, and she doesn't want to revisit those things. And it's also symbolized by the separation in the apartment. And then at some point, your mother tells you, okay, so she's kind of pressuring you to have your own voice and to pick up the fight. And you tell her, I have nothing to say. And she said, no, you have to make a speech, you have to make a statement. Do you think that the film that we all saw is your statement?
No, I don't. It's really funny. I realized that I couldn't understand. I think it has to do, you reach a certain age and you're looking at yourself in the mirror and there's a question being asked of you, which is, are you going to take responsibility for the society that you're living in? And looking in that mirror, I realized I don't have that in me. Neither her conviction nor her courage. And I think that's the reason why in the first half of the film, I think you can sometimes feel my anger, because I'm trying to get from her the heart of what motivated her to do that. And for her, there's no answer, but it's logical. It's what you do. And so it's very frustrating for me, because I can't get at something that for her is just an obvious thing that any adult has to do towards their children or towards their students. And it's true that she turns the tables on me in the film, because she ends up putting me in the hot seat, saying, okay, now it's your turn. What happened is we were both invited to hold a speech at a political rally, and she said yes, and I said no. And there was a real moment of, really? You said no? You know, so, and I think when in my most honest moments, I was trying to make a film that is a mea culpa. It's a mea culpa to my mother, and it's a mea culpa to my country, that I'm not going to be that person who's going to fight to make it a better place. I'm going to be the person who runs away. And it's a hard truth to accept of yourself, also a hard one to admit publicly, but that's who I am. And it's funny because my mother was with me one time. We were doing a debate like this after the screening, and someone said, okay, your daughter, she can't hold speeches, but she's done her own speech by making this film. And my mother's response was, maybe, but it's not enough. So that gives you an idea of the pressure.
Yes, well, then again, if you've watched the film, you know that she's really never happy about results. She's also very cynical, and in a very touching way, but on your side, there's more optimism. I mean, the end of the film is, what kind of role did you play in the end of the film, this opening of the door? Did you scripted that, or did you push for that? Because it's happening in front of the camera.
It's very strange. You know, when I started making this film, there was no possibility in real life, in any of our minds, that this door would ever open. It was a given that for our apartment would forever remain divided. So when I was writing the script for the film, in the script, the door always remained closed, because there was never a chance that it would open. And by a very strange conjuncture of circumstances, we ended up in a position where we could open the door. And we were all very unprepared. And so we waited for a very long time before we reached the family decision to do it. And then once we decided to do it, I decided I would film it. And it's very, very funny, because that evening I realized, once we had opened the door, I realized it happened on but on the exact date of the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was something incredibly symbolic in what had happened, which was unplanned completely. But I think you can feel in the film that it wasn't for any of us a triumphant moment.
No, she says, I preferred my apartment with the door closed. Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, all of the protagonists of this story are dead. They're gone. So there's no feeling of some kind of... And also I became attached, very attached over time to our invisible neighbor. So there was no... It was a very emotionally complicated situation. And one I wasn't sure belonged in the film. And then in the end, because of course the film becomes a metaphor for something else, the need to open this space became, you know, definitely part of the film. But it wasn't at all something that I had planned on.
It certainly brings a closure to a political situation that has none. So at least storytelling-wise, I mean, it works very well. So I already spoke too much. I'm opening the floor to questions. Do you have any questions in the audience? I have to tell you that I have those spotlights in the face, so make wide gestures. You should have a microphone or stand. Yes?
Thank you very much for making this film. And telling the story of the house. I lived in the same neighborhood in Belgrade. I was passing by the house every day without knowing the story. My question is actually about the events that you discuss. And I was wondering, why do you stop in 2000 and not continue until, for example, 2003? Because we see the face of Zoran Djindjic in the film, but not what happened to him afterwards.
It's exactly for the reason I described earlier. At some point, it became more important to show you how the circle has closed today than to take you through it. I mean, it was never going to be a historical film. It was never going to be a film that could tell you a century of history. But when I was thinking about the key things that I wanted to look at, I felt I took you far enough with my mother's admission of the fact that when they took power, they were unprepared. They didn't know what to do. And so I felt that, you know, that helps you understand the sentiment of disillusion and disappointment that came after the revolution. And the reason you do see Djindjic earlier on in the film is precisely to show that, to indicate that he had a role to play, but it's not part of this film to tell you that story. But it was a long, you know, there was a long reflection behind that decision.
Another question in the audience? Yes, sir? Maybe you can bring, or someone else has the microphone, I don't know. Otherwise, there's a question just right there in the middle. Good evening.
Okay, yeah, working. Just a very short question and addressed, I would say, to your generation. I was just wondering if the film had been or was screened in Serbia, and how could the young generation of people from your generation reacted to that exactly today, nowadays?
Yes, the film was shown in Serbia. We first had a premiere in a cinema of 3,500 seats, which was an extraordinary event, but mostly because my mother and the protagonist of the film were there. And what happened is people started applauding during the film. And I kind of looked left and everyone was crying, and I looked right and everyone was crying, and I realized we were living through a moment of collective catharsis. You know, that something was happening to all of us because we were having this story finally told. And then the film came out in cinemas, and what really was important, you know, what it brought most to me is I did quite a few Q&As after the screenings, and there was a lot of young people, but really young, 16, 17-year-olds who were coming there with their friends. Some of them went to see it 2 or 3 times. And at one of these debates, one of these girls raised their hand and she said, thank you for telling us this story because no one's ever told it to us. But then she said, and I would never trust my parents to tell it to me. And that's when I started thinking, we have a real problem here. You know, because we really have an incapacity, because we're such a divided society, because we have no consensus over what we lived through. We're leaving young kids with kind of adrift in a real search for identity because we haven't told them the story of where we come from and what we've lived through. And I think that has serious consequences on their perception of politics and their willingness to engage in it. So.
But there has been also a very good feedback coming from the region. I mean, the other ex-Yugoslavian countries. I mean, recently the film won at Zagreb Docs in Zagreb, so Croatia. It won the regional prize. Were you there at the screening? What kind of feedback did you have from Croatians?
So for me, when I was making this film, there are kind of three audiences I have in my head. One is a Serbian audience that would have lived these events. So they're obviously going to be watching the film in one way. The second is an international audience that doesn't necessarily know that there is a Serbia, there was a Yugoslavia. So for them, I'm trying to tell a story that's a lot more universal about engagement and heritage and activism. But there's a third audience always in my head, which is an ex-Yugoslav audience, because I feel that as well, kind of they're a very special need to communicate with them. And one thing that really surprised me in Croatia is we've won 2 audience awards so far in Croatia, and that was really stunning. I kind of felt the film had achieved what I wanted it to do, which is to open a dialogue. I was at the screening with my mother. It was a very interesting Q&A. But one thing they said to us is we didn't know there was a resistance movement in Serbia. And I started thinking, you know, that's 300 kilometers away from Belgrade, and if they didn't know, it gives you an idea of the extent of the media blackout and the propaganda that was taking place in the 90s.
It's very good you say that, because I'm picking up on a question on Twitter. Someone, well, I lost the feed now, but someone was asking, how can we know the real history when the media are constantly doing revisions of it? Do you think that you've been submitted to that? Do you think that this is also how you were educated, with different kind of versions of the same story?
I think as a consequence of growing up in a country where someone's always, you know, the kind of tabloid headlines are always the final truth of Tito's Yugoslavia, the final truth of, you know, I have a real instinctive distrust of final and of truth, you know, because I don't believe that our differences and the differences of how we've lived through those years are so great that I actually don't think anyone should be striving to reach a final truth or a final version of events. And one reason the film is called The Other Side of Everything is because I was trying to create within the film a space in which there is room for my mother's version of events and Nada's version of events. And one thing that was really important for me was to show all of these group scenes. I grew up in a house that was a political salon. It was always like that, even in my grandparents' time. And so as a child even, I would watch my parents and their friends argue politics, but in a really intense way. And you can see in the film, you know, they are deeply divided politically. Russia, US, war, anti-war. But the thing is that I grew up in a house where people could be so opposed politically and yet remain lifelong friends. I grew up in a home in which it was possible to disagree fundamentally politically and still remain friends. But I didn't grow up in a country where it's possible to disagree politically and still remain together. And I just wanted to make a film in which there is enough space for these differences in opinion. And I don't think the media is built around those kinds of narratives that are encompassing and engaging and open, which is where I see a real path for documentary cinema.
So you mentioned documentary cinema. This is what you do. It's your second documentary. You have another one in preparation, and you want to stick to documentaries because someone on Twitter is saying that the film that I just saw is very cinematographical in the sense of a feature film. What are your influences? Do you have influences in the mainstream cinema or auteur cinema, and did you use them when you shot this one?
I did. I confess that I don't see a dividing line between documentary and fiction. For me, it's cinema. I do see a dividing line between reportage and documentary, which has to do with facts and objectivity and proof. But for me, documentary is cinema, and I make it for a big screen, and I make it with the idea that there's a viewer in the dark who I want to take on an emotional journey. So that's the kind of demands that I'm trying to put before myself in terms of the form and the feeling of the film. In terms of inspiration, I mean, it might surprise you, but the biggest one has been Hitchcock's Rebecca, because...
It's surprising.
Because the beauty of that film is that he creates a character that exists, that dominates the film, but you never see her. And so for me, for a long time, there was this idea that you would never see what's on the other side, you know. So that was one. The other is The Garden of the Fizzicontinis, because it tells the story of a family and through it a historical. So a lot of cinematic influences.
But you didn't study cinema, right?
No, I didn't study cinema, no.
So what did you study?
I studied political science.
Oh, big news.
Here's the thing. I thought You know, when I was 11 years old, the war began and the student protest against the war began. And I heard that the students were marching towards Milosevic's house. And I so badly wanted to see that I ran away from school to join them. And I ran into my mother at the head of the of the students. And I got into a lot of trouble. But she let me stay with them. And that established a pattern that lasted for a decade where I followed her to the protests and to her speeches. And I thought that was going to be my life, you know, activism and engagement. And I really believed in the power of political engagement. And then when I was 21, we had this revolution that I feel obliged to say like this. And the extent of I don't know how else to describe this, my loss of political faith is so profound and so deep that I ended up really in a kind of, you know, in a very bad place. And cinema opened the door. Cinema was for me a language of communication with the world that I believed in. I no longer believe in the possibility of the language of politics to get us out of this mess. I think in political speeches, manifestos, I don't believe that will be the key that's going to unlock our ability to fix this world, because it desperately needs fixing. And for some reason or other, documentary cinema I believe in. I believe that it can open a kind of conversation that might help us move forward. So yes, cinema was not my calling. It found me. It's not something that I was seeking.
And you found a new voice in it. You found your own voice.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's obvious. Yes. Yes, sir, here in the front. Or someone else has the microphone. Sorry, I don't see it, but there's a question right here.
Thank you very much for the movie. I hope everybody in the audience agrees with me. Please send our regards from Brussels to your mother. Really enjoyed her company. I just wanted to ask you both, as a cinematographer and as a political scientist, coming and speaking from this point here, especially from all of the filmmakers from ex-Yugoslavia countries who go and do this sort of events on the international level. What do you have in mind to prepare in the future? Do you think you will just have to always talk about Yugoslav topics or anything? All this was, you know, sort of a launching pad for your career in one way. But do you think that all of this sort of filmmakers who want to be documentary filmmakers coming from these regions, in Beaux-Arts especially, we've been, you know, to Balkan traffic, and there's so many events here, and it's always, you know, this the same artists talking about, you know, this times and this topic as if they're not able to get away from it. They're branded by it, and although I assume you don't live in Belgrade anymore, therefore, but it's still something which you need to be connected with. So how would you see your role as a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker in the future, who is at the same time has his past covering these topics? Will you think, will you need to do them in the future as well, or will you maybe try it another way?
Yeah, okay, this question was also asked on Twitter, very short, in 160 characters. And it was the exact same question, so so basically, are you continuing to do Yugoslavian?
Am I done with Yugoslavia?
Yes, okay. So is it your brand or not?
The question is Yugoslavia done with me? There are many projects that I have in my head that have nothing to do with Yugoslavia. And I hope there will be a moment to make them. But what seems to be happening, my next project happened, it's already almost finished shooting, but we're starting the editing. It tells, again, the story of something that Yugoslavia was involved in, but it's not necessarily about Yugoslavia. It's about the birth of something called the non-aligned movement. So it's more about this kind of moment of decolonization of Africa and Asia. I can't seem to get away from it, though, and it's not by choice. And sometimes I wonder whether we are just simply all traumatized by the fact that we lost our country, and that's something that will haunt us for a long time. Because I have a problem with the fact that when I'm asked what I am, my feeling is Yugoslav, but you can't be Yugoslav anymore. So that is obviously some form of trauma that will stay. But there's something else I think that's at work, which is our inability to tell our story is, I think, probably the single most important paralyzing factor preventing, in my opinion, the region moving forward, or definitely Serbia. And I think, you know, my first film began when I witnessed things being thrown away into a truck in the film studios in Belgrade. There's this constant need to stop things from disappearing. You know, the archive that you see in this film of the resistance is stuff that's disappearing. It took me 2 years to gather images of the resistance to Milosevic because they don't exist in the public sphere. It was private individuals and VHS tapes in their basements. So you see things being erased before your eyes, you see things disappearing, and I think the natural documentary instinct is to try and save that. And so you get trapped. You get trapped telling those stories because you feel like someone has to do it. But I can't necessarily say that it's my choice to be constantly reworking this era.
Other questions? Yes?
Thanks for the movie. And give a hug to your mom from me. She's very sweet. What I've seen.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of scared of her.
My question is related to that. The whole movie I've seen, not being from Yugoslavia, I see violence and aggression and expressions and things like that. There's never been a warmth in the whole movie. And it's a lot of silo characters as well and distant focus. But at the end, you give a hug. I think it's you. And that felt very good. And is that the basis of your problems in your country or the story you have so far covered? That you don't seem to have that warmth in any of the things I see till the whole end.
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily our national characteristic, because there's definitely, I think the way people think of Serbia is an excess of every form, so an excess of kind of exuberance as well, which is visible in our cinema or in our music and so on. But there is a question about why there is so much violence. I mean, you know, there's always been, I always feel that there's two questions to be asked. One is why Yugoslavia broke apart, why it collapsed. But the other question I think that you could ask almost separately is why did it collapse so violently? You know, why couldn't it separate the way Czechoslovakia separated? And there I think you come to a very interesting paradox, which is that our entire story of ourself, or our self-perception of ourself, is built on war. You know, the oldest museum in Serbia is the military museum. And Yugoslav cinema, for example, during the communist period, there was something like 880 feature films produced. More than 400 of them tell the story of the Second World War. We are a country that paid dearly during the First and Second World War in terms of the loss of population. And the war narrative is something that we were all raised on. And I wonder sometimes if that has a role to play in this proximity that we might have to violence. I don't know if that helps answer the question, though.
It's an open question, so any answer is good.
Thank you. I have a question about the other side of everything. I mean, this is the topic of the film as well, and you've been traveling a lot with that film since more than a year now, and meeting a lot of people in different countries, people appreciating the film. Have you actually met the other side? I mean, people that don't like the film? Because we know what's happening. Look at Hungary, look at Poland, Italy, Brazil, Serbia. I mean, this kind of rise of extremism, right wing as well. Did you meet those people? Are they watching the film? Are they reacting to the film? Have you been confronted to them?
I've had some interesting experiences, for sure. Coming both from the left and the right, interestingly enough, for me. And where I felt it was most productive was if they were coming at the film and at a conversation after the film in an open way. So I've even had people say to me, just the other day someone said to me, this guy came and said, you know, my mother is exactly opposed to your mother on every single thing. But when she watched the film, she really appreciated the honesty in it. And then we had a conversation because they were pro-Milosevic and so on. And when I was making it, it was really important for me. I didn't care to make a film that speaks to my side. That was really not of any interest to me. My interest was to see, could I make a film that could reach the other side and be, you know, open enough and honest enough to allow for some kind of debate. And when that's happened, it's been really gratifying. Of course, there's people who, you know, come at it with a very closed mindset and then, you know, choose to not engage with it because it, you know, doesn't fulfill their expectations. But I think that's normal for any situation.
So we'll have to wrap soon. I will take another question in the audience.
Right here.
Right here, there's someone in the center. No, you have to speak in the microphone, otherwise online they will not hear you. Oh, there's someone who has the microphone. I'm sorry, sir.
Sorry. Thank you for such an intimate film, yet universal. It was very interesting to laugh in a documentary. I think this is quite hard to achieve. My question was about how you chose to portray yourself. You're very present. Your point of view is very clear. But when we see you through a reflection or the back of you. I was wondering what you meant by showing yourself this way.
I hadn't intended to be in the film in any way, and you can notice this from the fact that I'm not wearing a mic, which is why you almost don't hear my voice very well in many scenes. I had no idea there was a place for me in this film. And part of the journey of making it in these 5 years was to understand that if I wanted to speak on an emotional and intimate level, I have to let people close to me. I have to let them enter the film through the way I'm feeling and seeing things in Serbia today. So from that moment on, it became clear that my presence is needed. But because I'm the first person filming, it has to, you can't see me in the shot because then who's behind the camera? So once I helped you identify that I'm the person filming and engaging with my mother and asking her, we went through the rushes to try and find these shots where I kind of enter the frame to fix her mic, or that you understand my presence. But it was never clear to me at the outset that the film would be told from my point of view. I really thought it would be told from the apartment's point of view. I thought it would be that would be the central character of the film. But then, as I said, because along the way the story shifted and the stakes of the film shifted, I began to realize that it was going to take a lot more personal courage than I had anticipated, and that I would need to put myself into it as well.
So I will just conclude with an anecdote. Something cute happened. We were back at the end of the screening with Mila, and this was the scene of the door, the opening of the door, and she heard you laughing, and you were just mentioning that it's nice to laugh during such a documentary. Apparently it was new for you, a new reaction from the audience. So you see, even after 1 year of tour of a film like this, what's happening in a screening room is unique. And I thought this was very beautiful that you were so surprised that people were laughing, positively surprised. So Mila, thank you so much. Thank you for the film. Thank you for your presence. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. And
thank you to all the organizers, all the people that made this possible. Thank you to the people online. And I'll see you again tomorrow with another screening. Women at War. Thank you.
Wow. You were really struggling there, and I was like, that's really impressive.
Yes, that's what it is. I'm hyperactive, so I always have...